The grease-scented air of the Morning Glory diner was thick with the silent tension of a held breath. Every customer was pretending to be absorbed in their coffee or eggs, but their eyes were all fixed on table 7. Clara, her apron stained with the ghosts of 1,000 breakfasts, felt the heat of their collective gaze like a physical weight on her shoulders. The source of the humiliation was a young man who called himself J-Flex, a name as synthetic as the lurid pink streaks in his hair. He held his phone up, its single black eye aimed directly at her face, a smirking narrator for an audience of unseen thousands. "And here we have it, folks," he announced, his voice a slick, condescending purr. "The world's slowest waitress. Can she even remember a simple order? Or is that tired brain as empty as her tip jar?" His followers, he knew, would love this. The algorithm fed on cruelty. A few of his friends at the table snickered, their laughter thin and sharp in the heavy quiet. Clara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back to stop them from shaking. She could feel the phone's lens dissecting every line on her face, every stray wisp of graying hair that had escaped her bun. She was 58 years old, a widow for 6 of them, and this was not the life she had imagined. But it was her life, and she had always faced it with a quiet, unyielding dignity. A dignity that was now being stripped away, pixel by pixel, for public amusement. In the far corner of the diner, occupying a string of booths bolted together, sat 23 men. They were a landscape of worn leather, faded denim, and road-hardened silence. Patches bearing the winged death's head of the Hell's Angels adorned their backs, a silent declaration of allegiance that needed no amplification. They had been eating their pancakes and steak and eggs with a slow, deliberate rhythm, their presence a low hum of potential energy beneath the diner's strained quiet. They were watching, not just J-Flex but Clara. They saw the slight tremble in her lower lip she fought to control, the rigid set of her spine. They saw a woman weathering a storm, and they were very, very still. J-Flex leaned back, basking in the unease he was creating. "Okay, Karen," he sneered, deliberately using the name he knew would sting. "Let's try this again. I ordered the Grand Slam breakfast. That's 2 pancakes, 2 eggs, over easy, not scrambled like your face, 2 sausages and 2 strips of bacon. And a side of hash browns, extra crispy. Can you handle that? Or do I need to draw you a picture?" His phone remained locked on her, capturing her reaction, or lack thereof. The conflict was his stage, and Clara was his unwilling co-star. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably. A family in the next booth pulled their children a little closer. A pair of college students stared into their laptops, pretending to be deaf. The silence of the onlookers was an accomplice, a thick blanket of social cowardice that gave him permission to escalate. Clara simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "The Grand Slam, over easy, crispy hash browns. I understand," she said, her voice low but clear. It lacked the tremor he was hoping for, the crack of anger or tears that would make the video go viral. This seemed to enrage him more than any outburst could have. "You understand?" he mimicked in a high-pitched, mocking tone. "Wow, a breakthrough. She understands basic English. Let's give her a round of applause, people." He started a slow, sarcastic clap. No one joined in. The only sound was the slap of his palms and the low, almost imperceptible scrape of a heavy boot against the linoleum floor from the corner booths. The sound was a warning, a single, deep note played on a cello in a room full of violins. It was ignored. J-Flex, high on his own performance, was deaf to anything but the sound of his own voice. He saw Clara not as a person but as a prop. Her quiet endurance was a challenge to the very foundation of his online persona, which was built on provoking loud, messy, and monetizable reactions. Her refusal to break was a denial of his power, and it was intolerable. He needed to shatter her composure. Clara turned to walk toward the kitchen, her movements measured and deliberate. Each step was an act of defiance. As she moved, the diner became a gallery of her life's unseen moments. This place, with its cracked vinyl seats and the perpetual scent of brewing coffee, was more than a job. It was a sanctuary. It was where her husband, Frank, a man carved from oak and quiet honor, had proposed to her 35 years ago. He had fumbled with the ring over a plate of blueberry pancakes, his large, grease-stained mechanic's hands surprisingly gentle. Frank had been a Marine, serving 2 tours in places he never spoke of, but whose shadows sometimes flickered in his eyes in the dead of night. He taught her that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but the steadiest hand in the storm. "Dignity, Clara," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "It's the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it to them." After the cancer took him, fast and brutal, this diner was all she had left. The familiar faces, the rhythm of the orders, the simple act of service. It was a lifeline. The tips paid the bills, barely, but the work mended the frayed edges of her grief. Every clean plate was a small victory, every satisfied customer a quiet affirmation that she could still contribute, still matter. The humiliation she felt now was not just about a rude customer. It was a desecration of that memory, a violation of the quiet peace she had fought so hard to build in the wreckage of her life. She was not just a waitress. She was a widow holding on to the last vestiges of a shared life, a woman of immense, unseen fortitude, pouring coffee for a world that rarely looked close enough to see who she really was. This TikToker, with his cheap cruelty and hungry camera, was trampling on sacred ground. The pressure in the diner ratcheted up, becoming a palpable force. J-Flex, seeing Clara retreat toward the kitchen, decided the show needed a climax. He needed a physical reaction, a spill, a shout, something to edit into a dramatic loop. As she passed his table, he deliberately stuck out his foot. It was a clumsy, obvious motion, designed to trip her. But Clara, accustomed to navigating the tight spaces of the diner, sidestepped it with a practiced grace that surprised him. Thwarted, his face twisted into a mask of petulant rage. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he shouted, grabbing the tall glass of ice water from his table. With a flick of his wrist, he flung its contents at her retreating back. The icy water soaked through the thin fabric of her uniform, clinging to her skin like a shroud of cold shame. A collective gasp rippled through the diner. This was no longer just words. It was a physical assault, a line crossed in broad daylight. The family in the next booth stood up, throwing cash on their table as they hustled their wide-eyed children toward the door. The college students finally looked up from their screens, their faces pale with shock. Yet no one spoke up. No one moved toward him. They were frozen, caught between the fear of getting involved and the shame of their own inaction. The community of strangers remained silent, their paralysis a testament to the chilling power of a single bully with a smartphone. Clara stopped. She did not turn around. She simply stood there for a long moment, the water dripping from the hem of her apron onto the checkered floor. Each drop was an echo of the diner's deafening silence. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation on her skin. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting second, she saw Frank's face, his steady gaze, and heard his voice. "Don't you give it to them, Clara." She took a deep, shuddering breath, straightened her already rigid spine, and continued walking toward the kitchen without a single word or a backward glance. Clara pushed through the swinging doors into the heat and clatter of the kitchen. She leaned against the stainless steel counter, her body finally allowing a single violent tremor to pass through it. The cook, a burly man named Sal, turned from the grill, his face a mixture of pity and anger. "That kid's a menace, Clara. You want me to go out there?" he asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Clara shook her head, her gesture sharp and final. "No, Sal. Please. It's what he wants," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She grabbed a dry dish towel and began to blot at her soaked uniform, her movements methodical. Her action was one of quiet, profound resistance. She would not give him the satisfaction of a public confrontation. She would not be a character in his pathetic drama. Her dignity was hers, and it would not be surrendered in exchange for a moment of fleeting, righteous anger. She picked up a fresh notepad and a pen. Her hand was steady now. She walked back through the swinging doors into the dining room. The silence that greeted her was different this time. It was no longer just tense. It was heavy with shame. J-Flex, looking momentarily confused by her reappearance, quickly recovered his smirk. Decided to come back for more? Ready to take my order now? He taunted, raising his phone again. Clara walked not to his table, but to the one next to it, where an elderly man sat alone, looking flustered and upset by the commotion. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and calm, a beacon in the charged atmosphere. "I believe you were ready to order? I'm sorry for the delay." Her selfless act of service, her deliberate choice to perform her duty with grace under fire, was more powerful than any retort. She was not a victim to be pitied. She was a professional at her work, a woman of immense composure. She was showing them all, the bully, the silent onlookers, and the men in the corner, exactly who she was. A distinct shift occurred in the diner's atmosphere. It was subtle at first, like the turning of a tide far offshore. The whispers started. At a table near the window, a woman leaned toward her husband. "Did you see that?" He threw water all over her and she just kept going. The husband nodded, his eyes fixed on Clara, his earlier annoyance at the disturbance replaced by a dawning respect. "She's got more class in her little finger than that punk has in his whole body," he murmured. The shame that had paralyzed the patrons began to curdle into a quiet, collective anger. Not at Clara, but at themselves for their silence, and at the boy with the phone who had poisoned their morning. They saw her now not as a Karen or a slow waitress, but as a pillar of grace. Her soaked uniform was not a mark of humiliation, but a badge of honor. Her refusal to engage on his level had elevated her, exposing his cruelty for what it was: shallow, pathetic, and weak. The college students, who lived their lives through screens, finally saw the real-world consequence of online toxicity. One of them began recording J-Flex, not with glee, but with a documentarian's cold fury. The narrative was being reclaimed. J-Flex sensed the change. The attention was no longer on his terms. The eyes on him were not entertained. They were judgmental. His audience in the room had turned on him. "What are you all looking at?" he snapped, his voice losing some of its confident swagger. He was losing control of the scene, and it made him desperate. He turned his phone back to Clara, who was now calmly explaining the daily specials to the elderly gentleman, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the tension. The power dynamic had been inverted not by a shout, but by a whisper of decency. Then came the sound. It was not loud, but it was definitive. The sound of 23 heavy chairs scraping against a linoleum floor in near-perfect unison. It cut through the whispers, a sound of pure, coordinated intent. The Hells Angels rose as one. They were a wall of leather and denim, of beards and tattoos, of sheer, unadulterated presence. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Their movements were deliberate, economical, and filled with a gravity that seemed to bend the air around them. The light from the diner's windows glinted off the chrome studs on their vests, off the chains that linked wallets to belts. They formed a silent, formidable phalanx, blocking the path to the exit. The leader, a man with a gray-streaked beard and eyes that had seen more miles of asphalt than most people had seen of life, took a single step forward. He was built like a mountain that had decided to go for a walk. He wore no expression at all, which was somehow more terrifying than any snarl. The diner fell into a complete and utter silence. Even the sizzling of the grill from the kitchen seemed to have ceased. J-Flex and his friends froze, their smirks evaporating from their faces, replaced by the pale, clammy look of sudden, dawning fear. They were no longer the predators in this ecosystem. The apex predators had just announced their presence, and they had done it without saying a single word. The bikers didn't look at J-Flex. Not yet. Their collective gaze, 100 tons of silent judgment, was fixed on Clara. They were waiting. They were watching her. The entire situation now hinged on her, the woman they had all, until moments ago, dismissed. The lead biker, whose vest identified him as Preacher, walked slowly toward Clara. He stopped a respectful distance away, his sheer size casting a shadow over her. He ignored J-Flex completely, as if the boy were nothing more than a piece of furniture. "Ma'am," Preacher said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. That was my brother's table you just took an order from. He gestured with his chin toward the elderly man, who was also wearing a small, almost unnoticeable pin on his lapel, a Marine Corps emblem. He gets a little rattled sometimes. Noise. You handled that with respect. He then turned his head, his gaze finally falling upon J-Flex. The weight of that look was immense. This boy, on the other hand, doesn't seem to know the meaning of the word, J-Flex stammered. His phone now held limply at his side. Hey man, it's for my channel, it's just content. Preacher took another slow step forward, and the boy's words died in his throat. Content? Preacher repeated, the word tasting like something foul in his mouth. You think humiliating a woman who works harder in one day than you have in your entire life is content? He paused, letting the silence stretch. We've been coming to this diner for 15 years. Every third Sunday. We knew her husband, Frank. He was a Marine, a real one, a man who understood sacrifice. He fixed our bikes. He was our friend. He was a man of honor. He let that last word hang in the air. Frank would have been proud of the way his wife carried herself today. Proud of her dignity. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Clara was not just a random waitress. She was part of a history, part of a community. She was the widow of an honored friend. The bikers were not defending a stranger. They were protecting one of their own. Clara looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of profound, heart-wrenching gratitude. Someone remembered. Someone saw. The recognition was swift and absolute. Preacher turned his back on J-Flex, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Tank! He rumbled over his shoulder. A biker who looked like he could bench press the entire kitchen stepped forward. He didn't touch J-Flex. He simply stood in front of him, blocking his path, his arms crossed over a chest as wide as a doorway. The message was clear. You are not leaving until we say you can. Preacher walked to Clara. He reached inside his leather vest and pulled out a thick envelope. This is from the boys, he said, his voice softening slightly. For Frank's memory. And for the best damn service in the state. He placed the envelope gently on the counter next to her. Then, in a gesture that stunned the entire diner into breathlessness, he took off his own vest, his cute, a sacred object bearing his club's colors, his history, his identity, and he draped it over Clara's shoulders. It was heavy with leather and patches, and it smelled of the road, of engine oil, and of freedom. It was the highest honor he could bestow, a symbol of ultimate protection and respect. You're under our protection now, ma'am, he said quietly. No one will ever disrespect you in this place again. The other bikers nodded in silent, solemn agreement. The community, finally broken from its spell, acted. The man who had admired Clara's class earlier stood up and walked to J-Flex's table. He pulled a $100 bill from his wallet and dropped it in front of Clara. This is for you, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. And this, he said, gesturing to J-Flex's unpaid bill, is on him. He can pay for his meal before he even thinks about leaving. One by one, other patrons came forward, leaving tips on the counter. 5s, 10s, 20s, a spontaneous outpouring of support. It was an apology for their silence, a recognition of her strength. The pile of money grew, a testament to a community finding its conscience. The closure was not loud or violent. It was quiet, resolute, and deeply symbolic. Tank, the massive biker, finally addressed J-Flex. Your phone, he said, his voice a low command. Trembling, J-Flex handed it over. Tank didn't smash it. He simply held it, scrolled to the video J-Flex had been filming, and held down the delete button until the file vanished into the digital ether. He then placed the phone on the table. Pay your bill. Add a tip. A real one. Then you and your friends will walk out of here, and you will never come back. If you ever post a single frame of what happened here today, or if you ever show your face in this town again, we will find you. And we will have a conversation about respect. Do you understand? J-Flex, his face ashen, nodded frantically, unable to form words. He fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking so badly he could barely pull out his credit card. He paid the bill, adding a 50% tip under Tank's watchful eye. Then, he and his friends scurried out of the diner like rats from a sinking ship, disappearing into the anonymity of the world outside. The tension in the diner finally broke, replaced by a warm, quiet calm. Preacher gently took his vest from Clara's shoulders. "You take care, Clara," he said, his eyes holding hers for a moment. She could only nod, her heart too full for words. The 23 bikers filed out of the diner as quietly as they had risen. The peace was broken only by the sudden, deafening roar of 23 Harley-Davidson engines firing to life in the parking lot. The sound was not a threat. It was a salute. It was the sound of loyalty, of brotherhood, of a promise kept. The motorcycles pulled out onto the highway, their thunder fading into the distance, leaving behind a diner transformed. Clara stood by the window, watching them go, the thick envelope of cash clutched in her hand. The morning sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The diner was full again, the patrons talking in low, respectful tones. Sal came out from the kitchen and placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. "On the house," he said with a warm smile. Clara looked around the room, at the faces that were no longer strangers, and she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since Frank was alive. Her dignity had not been taken, it had been magnified. She was no longer just a waitress. She was Clara, and she was respected. The roar of the engines was gone, but the echo of their honor remained.